Okay, everybody, let's go ahead and talk about some of the things with regards to voting. In this lecture, we're going to talk about why people vote, how people vote, and also we're going to focus on some political parties. So, one thing about a democracy that we need to understand is one of the things that gives legitimacy to a democracy or to government is free and fair elections. And specifically here in the United States, we don't necessarily choose policy when we look at who we're going to vote for. We usually go with people. I mean, there's going to be a segment of people that vote based off of policy, but that's not really the determining factor that people use. And we'll go into that. So when we kind of look at why people vote in the U.S., we focus on, about 5 factors. The policy voters, which we kind of talked about just a minute ago, but they're not that big of a group of people. Party voters, group benefit voters, and the two most common, retrospective voters and candidate image voters. And don't worry, we're going to go into each of these in a little bit. So there's that myth that we talked about, that people vote based off of a candidate's policy stance. Now, we can understand that in some instances, we may have an idea about how a particular candidate feels about an issue or maybe a really controversial subject. But for the most part, we sometimes don't really have a good view of some specific policy issues that some candidates are for. Sometimes people will vote based off of ideology. So I'm going to want you to remember these numbers. 36% of candidates describe themselves as conservative, 25% describes them as liberal, and 39% describe themselves as moderates. And as we're going to see in a couple of slides, the moderate section, or the moderate group, is probably the most important group here in the United States. And, it's kind of the understanding that we have high levels of political polarization right now. Democrats and Republicans are probably about as far as they have ever been with regards to belief systems and ideologies and all that good stuff. And it's an interesting thing that we take a look at because, where can we find some common ground? Where can we agree on stuff? Where can we maybe come to a consensus on an issue? And that's really, really difficult with the polarization we have in America right now. Another thing, party voting is a powerful influence. Usually people might just vote straight Democrat, straight Republican. There's still that segment of the population that is out there. Now, there's also group bases of voting, right? And in a little bit, we're going to talk about a couple of terms, realignment and de-alignment. Just hold off a minute, and we'll get back to those. But just remember those terms when we get back to them. So when we talk about groups that are kind of tied to political parties, Democrat voters are disproportionately drawn from labor union members, people that live in big cities, Jewish people, and African Americans. Now, the author says Catholics, but I don't necessarily agree with that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Republican voters are disproportionately drawn from rural, small town, and suburban Protestant whites and business people. Okay, so those are kind of the demographics of our voting groups here in the U.S. Sometimes people will vote retrospectively, and this is probably the most common way people vote. So retrospectively voting means that you use past judgment to determine whether or not you're going to vote for a candidate. Voters tend to hold the incumbent party responsible for hard economic times, and the voter perception about general economic conditions rather than the personal well-being affects his or her vote. Now, at times we may hold a party in office responsible for maybe hard economic times. Sometimes we may hold a president responsible for hard economic times, even though they may really not have an effect on that. So we kind of got to get a perspective about, we take things and we are very much a what have you done for me lately society. Therefore, we kind of, anytime there's some type of, maybe some type of issues that might cause us some type of anxiety or some type of worry, we tend to blame the party that is in office when that happens. And we're talking about maybe the people that are in the middle. And there's been issues in history or instances in history where we can see this happening. One of the most common instances that I like to use as an example is the 2008 presidential election where Barack Obama was elected president. Now remember, George Bush had been in the presidency for 8 years. And during those 8 years, we had 9/11, where he had a lot of support. Then we had the War on Terror, which had a lot of support. Then we had the war in Iraq, where support kind of started to wane a bit. And then, you know, being in those wars a long time really weighed on people. And then we had the economic crisis of 2007 to 2008 when the housing market crashed. So I believe that when people decided who they wanted to vote for in the 2008 election, you know, I think John McCain suffered a bit from some of the things that happened during the George W. Bush administration. You know, imagine being a person that, you know, may have lost their job and lost their house. And when you decide, you know, it's time to come up and vote, you're going to say, okay, let me give the other party a shot in order to maybe make my life better. So, you know, and this happens, you know, cyclically. The midterms in 2022 are coming up, and it's going to be interesting to see if there's any types of changes in Congress due to some of the hard economic times we're going through as far as inflation, the pandemic, and all of that stuff. People also vote based off of a candidate's image. This is, you know, one of the more important ways in less partisan people, you know, how a person speaks, how a person carries himself, how a person is diplomatic. So there's a lot of things that might go into that as far as a candidate's image. Okay, so let's go ahead and kind of shift a little bit and talk about parties. So from the pluralist view, and remember, we're focusing on two theories this semester, pluralism and elite theory. Pluralist theory developed a responsible party model for the U.S. system. Hopefully this would be able to help people, you know, kind of develop and classify alternative policy positions, maybe being able to compromise and bargain, holding elected officials accountable, organizing legislatures to ensure party control, and to organize and direct campaigns. But when we look at this problems with the responsible party system, sometimes parties are oligarchical. And, you know, we see that now where there's a small number of people at the top making decisions for the greater whole. Maybe the masses within the party might not totally agree with what the elites in the party want. Party loyalty among voters has been declining over time. Mass media has replaced the party as a means of political communication. You know, things like social media also. And one thing is parties have no direct way to hold elected officials accountable. Primary elections undermine the power of party organizations and party elites. Now, looking at this last point, kind of remember this last point because I don't necessarily agree with this. What they're basically saying is that parties can control who gets the nomination for president. And we're going to kind of look at that and kind of dispel that in a little bit. But before we do that, we're going to kind of go through some histories of political parties. So during the time of the Revolution, one of the first parties was the Federalist Party, which was formed by Alexander Hamilton and favored a strong national government. The contrary party at that time was the Democratic Republican Party, which was led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They favored more state influence in federal government. After that, we had the era of good feeling from 1817 to 1825. Really had no problems during this time after the War of 1812. Relatively peaceful and really looking to prosper. We had the Anti-Mason Party in 1827 to 1828. The Masonics were a secret society, or the Freemason parties were a secret society that existed, and the Anti-Mason Party was looking to out people who were members of the secret order. After the elections of 1836, the party declined, and together with the National Republican Party, it eventually absorbed into a new party called the Whigs. So what was the Whig Party? The Whig Party was an American political party that was formed to oppose Andrew Jackson and the Democrats. They stood for high protective tariffs, national banking, and kind of federal aid for internal improvements with regards to infrastructure and stuff like that. The party was eventually destroyed, whether to allow expansion of slavery to the territories outside, kind of in the western part of the United States. The anti-slavery faction successfully prevented the nomination of its own incumbent, President Millard Fillmore, in the presidential election of 1852. When we saw the Whigs party break up, the voter base defected to the Republican Party, and various coalitions stayed and formed back into the Democratic Party. We're going to actually see kind of the evolution of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in a bit. So obviously we had the Civil War and Reconstruction. There were some nativist parties here, or the Know-Nothing Party, right? So we had the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and the Know-Nothing Party. The Know-Nothing Party was very much a nativist party, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But the Republican Party at the time supported business through the gold standard. If you don't understand what the gold standard is, do a quick Google search. It's pretty easy to understand. And then high tariffs to stimulate economic growth. Basically, you know what a tariff is. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. Anytime there is a cost associated with importing goods, they're going to pass that cost on to the consumer. So in a sense, what we're talking about here is that kind of the belief with tariffs is that, you know, if you have high tariffs, it might motivate a business to try to produce the good within the United States in order for it to kind of stimulate the economy. Some people call the parties the same, right? But and they refer to them as Tweedledee and Tweedledum. But, you know, these parties are very different, right? You know, we hear the term that, oh, they're all the same. You know, Tweedledee and Tweedledum, a couple of knuckleheads that, you know, are always kind of like gibbering and picking at each other. But in a sense, you know, it shows that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party were different. And we're going to kind of see when we go through history kind of how they switch. So we talked a little bit about nativist movements, and the whole concept of a nativist movement is a way to prevent the spread of, quote, inferior people in America. And one of the ways to do that was to control immigration. You know, nativists at a time, and when we kind of go in the evolution of history, we're going to see that at a time, the nativists were anti-Irish Catholic, then anti-German, then anti-Chinese, and anti-Mexican. And then we can even go into now and maybe, you know, put in anti-Central American or anti-Latinx people with regards to, you know, whole belief in nationalism, one language, one culture, one people. We had the Bull Moose Party, which was led by Teddy Roosevelt during the campaign in 1912. You know, there was a realignment of political parties in 1896, and the Republicans became the party of big business, much like what they are now. At the time, the Bull Moose Party was called the Progressive Party, and they instituted a lot of progressive reforms. You know, we talked about that in the past. And when this party broke up, a lot of them joined FDR's New Deal Party, which was kind of the start of the Democratic Party, which we know today. New Deal Democrats, or this New Deal coalition, was the alignment of interest groups and voting blocs in the United States that supported the New Deal. Remember, FDR came in with the New Deal to try to stimulate the economy, to try to give more power back to the federal government. As part of this group of people, you know, city machines were part of this, labor unions, blue-collar workers, minorities, farmers, white Southerners, people on some type of welfare, and intellectuals. And this is very kind of the nascent or the birth of the Democratic Party that we see today. The New Deal programs and FDR's civil rights stance, positive civil rights stance, brought many people to this party, but eventually evolved into the Democratic Party that we have now. Unfortunately for the Democrats, there was a group of people that weren't too keen on the civil rights movement, as well as kind of the beatnik, hippie counterculture that caused a fracture in the party. a lot of the blue-collar workers, specifically in the South, were still conservative and disliked the youth counterculture and the civil rights movement, so they broke off and created their own party called the Dixiecrats. These were states' rights Democrats who were short-lived segregationists. You know, they fought against the civil rights movement that was forming. It originated in 1948. One of the leaders was a guy named Strom Thurmond, who we'll talk a little bit about. And this was put into place to protect states' rights to legislate racial segregation, keeping people separated, keeping people out, and claiming that we have an overreaching, oppressive government. They wanted to keep Jim Crow laws and white supremacy. You know, Strom Thurmond, I mentioned him, ran for president in 1848, served in the Senate all the way up until 100 years old. So it's kind of weird that we have a segregationist that was still getting elected in the early 2000s. George Wallace, former governor of Alabama, ran for president 68, 72, 76. There was an assassination attempt that left him in a wheelchair, but he said he sought redemption. And ironically, these two people who were, you know, kind of racist, both had relations with people of other races. So it's all kind of, you know, the hypocrisy that we see. So we started to see the rise of the Republicans, which was based off of that northern white Protestant business people, small business owners, professionals, factories, farmers, and at that time, African Americans. Pro-business, supporting banking, the gold standards, the railroads, and high tariffs to protect the factory workers. And we saw industrialization growing really rapidly. The New Deal coalition collapsed, so the New Deal Democrats started to go away, partly because of the defection of white Southern Democrats because of the Civil Rights Act. At that time, Republicans won 5 of the 6 presidential elections from 68 to 88, with Ronald Reagan as the party's iconic conservative hero. And from 1992 to 2016, the Republicans have been elected to the White House in 3 of the 7 presidential elections. So the GOP extended its base in the South after 1968 using the Southern strategy that Nixon talked about. You know, kind of appealing to the Southerners who were traditionally conservative, evangelical Protestants, and now traditionalist Catholics. Remember how I said earlier that the Democrats had the Roman Catholics as part of their base? You know, I don't really think that exists anymore, because I think real traditional Catholics are going to be drawn more to the Republican Party because their stance on same-sex marriage, same-sex adoption, abortion, stem cell research, and all those social issues that really started to take light in the 70s and the 80s. So the Republican Party, you know, also has kind of segments or factions as part of it. You know, the religious right, which we just talked about, included with the moral majority, plus the Tea Party and the Freedom Caucus, who are groups that really look for limited government. So kind of the whole concept of small government, adherence to traditional values, the spreader of democracy, and the concept of supply-side economics, that trickle-down economic theory. We're actually going to visit that later in the semester. We also had the Reform Party. This was a third party found by H. Ross Perot. Ross Perot ran for president in 1992 and received 19% of the popular vote. Didn't receive any electoral college votes, but received 19% of the vote, which is astounding. A third party candidate to receive almost 20% of the popular vote is incredible, right? We also had Jesse Ventura, who was a former wrestler and actor, was elected governor of Minnesota in 1998. They focused on fiscal issues such as reducing the federal deficit and debt, instituting term limits, reforming campaign finance and lobbying, and issues on trade. Unfortunately, the party started to die off in the 2000s as people such as Pat Buchanan and David Duke joined the party, and at one time former President Trump was a member. Pat Buchanan, a really conservative right-wing individual, at one time, has made some comments that he may think the Holocaust wasn't as bad as it was. So, anytime you say something that ignorant or that dumb, it's going to come back and get you. David Duke, former Grand Wizard of the KKK, not a good look to have that person a member of your party. They eventually died off as when Buchanan ran for president in 2004, they failed to receive at least 5% of the vote. Therefore, your federal matching goes away. When we do our taxes, if you notice, it always asks if you want to donate $3 to a federal political campaign. You have to meet certain criteria to be eligible for that. And the Reform Party actually lost it when Buchanan ran for president. Now, when we look at demographics, and this is going to include leaning, meaning people that may classify themselves as an independent but tends to support another party. So if we look at this, we can see right away, women are going to be Democrat at more instances than males. Blacks are going to be more Democratic than whites. So men are going to be more Republicans than women. So it's just something that's really easy to understand and to look at. And there's a link there if you want to look at things in more detail. I just put this out there to kind of give you an illustration of how certain demographic groups lean our vote. So we have, a variety of political parties here in the United States, but only two matter, to be honest with you, the Democrats and the Republicans. We have third parties such as the Libertarian Party, which is the biggest party the biggest third party in the U.S. They're on the ballot in 33 states, 33 out of the 50 states. The Green Party and the Constitutional Party, the reason sometimes these parties fail is because of ballot access. And that's really simple to understand, as we can see by this slide. The Libertarian Party, which is the biggest third party here, which is kind of a socially liberal, economically conservative party, are only on the ballot in 33 states, meaning they're not on the ballot in 17 other states. Now, can they conceivably win the presidency? Yeah, it's possible, but it's not likely because they don't have that ballot access in the other 17 states. Here's the platform if you want to look at it. It's a good illustration of some of the things that they're for and against. And if you look at it, you're going to notice that they're very much socially liberal, but economically conservative. Now, a lot of people are kind of detaching themselves from parties. And this is where we're going to get two terms kind of evident here out of our talk. The concept of de-alignment versus the concept of realignment. So de-alignment is the decline of the attractiveness of both parties. So if you have a group of people that drop out of a party because neither party appeals to them, that's called de-alignment. Now, realignment is something different. Realignment is when a demographic group detaches themselves from a party and realigns with another party. Remember how I mentioned Roman Catholics? I think Roman Catholics are a really good illustration of realignment, where you had the Democratic Party as a staple of, the Catholics as a staple of the Democratic Party in the 50s and the 60s. Then we come to the 70s and the 80s, where social issues really start to take precedent. And, kind of the stances that the Democratic Party had on abortion, had on gay marriage, had on gay rights, I think it caused a lot of traditional Roman Catholics to realign themselves with the Republican Party. But when we are running for president or running for some type of office, we have to appeal to the people in the middle. So we look at this and we can see here, our magic number is going to be 51%. So 51% wins you an election. So right here, we have a person that is liberal. Remember the numbers that we posted a couple of minutes ago where we said about 25% of the people identify themselves as liberal? Now, if that is true, in order to get to that 51%, we need to attract 26% of this 39% in here, right? So we need to attract an amount of people from the middle to move us to be able to win the election. So in order to appeal to these people, we have to move ourselves along the ideological spectrum in order to attract these people. So we have to be able to attract 26% of people in here to get to that 51% that we need here. Remember, it's 25% of people identify as liberal. If we could capture amount of people in here to win us the election, then we have to move ourselves closer to these people to get their votes. The same thing will work on the other side. Conservatives need to move themselves along the ideological spectrum to attract the middle voter. Now, we can't move far enough where we're going to alienate a group of people, because then these people here might not vote. So we still have to make our base happy and in turn also attract the middle voter in order to get to that 51%. I know it's kind of, a little bit convoluted, but I think if you guys think it out, it'll make a lot more sense, right? So you have to move yourself along the ideological spectrum in order to attach and to attract that 26% of people in the middle. So we talked about why third parties fail. So let's go ahead and talk about how we vote and what we vote for. So the United States is a single member district voting situation where the House of Representatives is carved into 435 single districts, and we have a representative for each district, and depending on the district we live in, we're going to vote for that person to represent us in Congress, right? Primaries are held here in California in June, and then the top 2 vote getters from each party move on to general election in November. Candidate who receives a plurality of votes at that time will win. We also have direct elections. It's kind of along the same lines of single member districts, and this involves the election of our Senate. The 17th Amendment gave citizens the right to vote for senator. In California, in the primary, the top 2 vote getters will face each other in the general election no matter what the party is. So if you have a primary where the Senate is involved and you have 2 Democrats which receive the 2 top votes, the top vote getters in the primary, then those 2 Democrats will face each other in a general election. And consequently, that happened in 2016, where in the primaries, Lorena Sanchez, as well as our Vice President Kamala Harris, were the 2 top vote getters in the primary, and then we saw 2 Democrats face each other in the general election in November. Now, I made the comment earlier that party elites can't control who is chosen or is who given the nomination for the presidency. I'm going to kind of try to dispel that in a talk right here. So when we talk about primaries, you remember here in California, primaries are held in June, and that's determines who's going to go on to the general election. Now, if we look at these figures on the screen, a participation rate or a turnout in a presidential election is right around 60 to 70%. For a primary, it's anywhere from 20 to 30, so roughly half. Let's go ahead and take a look at a real-world scenario, right? So the author says political party elites cannot control the selection of candidates. I disagree with this, and I'll show you why. If we look at the 2016 primary, we won't really look at 2020 because there's really no really intriguing stuff in there. But if we look at the 2020 election, this is a little bit more intriguing. So if we go back, hold on, I lost the slide. The way the Democrats do the delegates and choose their nominations for president, the Democratic Party uses pledged delegates as well as something called super delegates. In order to win the nomination for president, you need to have a majority of delegate votes at the Democratic National Convention. Of the 4,765 total Democrat delegates, 714 are super delegates. So 714 of these people are individuals such as governors, members of Congress, former presidents, other party leaders. So they are able to say who they want to choose for president or for who's to be the nominee. The Democrats use a proportional representation to determine how many delegates are awarded in each state, and we'll look at in a minute. But say, for example, here in California, if we would have had a primary, if one candidate gets 60% of the vote, the other candidate gets 40, then the total delegates available in the state of California, the winner will get 60% of the delegates, and the loser will get 40% of the delegates. And you just need a simple majority. Now, you know, I'm going to use the 2016 election because it's a little bit more clear here. There was accusations that the Democratic National Committee sandbagged the Bernie Sanders campaign. There was a WikiLeaks hack where the Democratic National Committee's email system was hacked. So what they found out in that WikiLeaks hack was that the DNC was bad-mouthing the Sanders campaign. The CFO thought it should be suggested to the media that Sanders was an atheist. At the time, the current head of the DNC, Donna Brazile, leaked primary debate questions to the Clinton campaign, which was totally unethical because that would be me like giving the answers of a test to only a couple of people as opposed to the whole class. And they also wanted to show that the Sanders campaign was disorganized. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So this is from the New York Times, and this is the delegate list from the primaries in 2016. And again, I'm using the 2016 because this is a little bit more clear to prove my point. So we're going to focus on the Democrats here, right? So we could see here Hillary Clinton won the nomination, right? You need 2,383 delegates to win. Hillary won 2,220, but that still didn't bring her to 2,383. In order to get past that, she needed 591 superdelegates. Remember, these are individuals. So when the author says that party elites cannot determine who the nominee is going to be, I'm going to disagree with that on the Democrat side, because we can see if we switch that 591 to Bernie, that would have pushed him past the criteria needed to win. Okay, so something that's kind of really easy to understand. So I just wanted to make sure that this is easy to understand and kind of familiar, as some of us might have heard about this earlier. But, you know, like I said, when they say that party elites can't control who the nominee is, I'm going to disagree, because if we put these 591 toward Bernie Sanders, he would have won the nomination. Okay, and then you can also take a look at here how the delegate count went in each state, and you could see we'll go down. At this time, I think the California primary was in March. Maybe wrong. I thought it was in March at this time. Well, it used to be in March, and we moved it to June to kind of force candidates to pay attention to California more. But you could take a look at this. The link is on there, and it's available for you to use. Did I pass it? So let's go ahead and take a look and wrap this up. So the Republicans do it a little more simply. You know, there's not many super delegates. You just need a simple majority to win. Now, one of the questions is, should we have a closed primary and open primary? A closed primary would be you can only vote for candidates that belong to the same party as you. Open primary, you can vote for anybody, and the winner from each party will advance to general election. A lot of people, I mean, we have here in California have a modified open, and we moved our primary from June to March, so that's maybe why we didn't see it here. So we can look here and go down to June. Again, I think I got a little bit excited talking and stuff and wasn't thinking right. So yeah, here's the California. We could see Hillary won 269 and delegates at 206. So our primary used to be in June. we moved it up to March to, to have candidates pay attention to California a little bit more, because at times there might be instances where the nominations are already decided before California even votes. Now, we know about money and the effects that money has on elections. Only about 0.5% of the U.S. population contributes about $200 or more to presidential or congressional campaigns. It's interesting because when we go and talk about this, we could see that maybe we don't have money to give, right? Maybe we can't afford to write more, give more money to people than maybe a couple of $100. And, one of the things about kind of, the semblance of wealthy candidates within the system, a court case called Buckley versus Vallejo, so it says that the government can't restrict the amount of money that people spend that is theirs to run an election. So this is an extension of free speech. So if you're rich and you want to run for a candidate, or you want to run for an office, you can spend as much money as you want. We talked a little bit of McCain-Feingold and the concept of money in elections in the interest group section. All right, make sure you understand that. Make sure you understand Citizens United. Political parties, elections are still very much of a fabric of our society, and something that's really interesting. Okay, thanks a lot.